Imagine this. On a blazing hot summer day in the rugged heartland of Wyoming, Garrett Lawson, a tough-as-nails widowed cowboy heads into town, only to find a beautiful bride left humiliated at the train station. At 42, she's labeled too old by her fiancé's cruel family and abandoned thousands of miles from home. But Garrett sees something different: strength, resilience, and a chance at redemption. In an impulsive move straight out of a Hollywood Western, he marries her on the spot. But will this risky gamble lead to disaster? Or could it revive his failing ranch and heal their wounded hearts? If you believe it's never too late for second chances and love stories forged from courage and grit, then stay tuned. This is one dramatic journey you can't afford to miss. Before we jump into this remarkable story, make sure you subscribe right now, because we've got plenty more heart-pounding, real-life dramas that'll remind you why life's greatest moments often come from its toughest trials. On a scorching summer day in 1885, Garrett Lawson rose before first light on his ranch just outside the town of Highvale, Wyoming. The morning sun stretched long beams across the dry fields, catching motes of dust that swirled in the air. Garrett sat on the edge of his bed, running his calloused thumb over the image of Lucy, his wife who had passed 3 years ago from a fever that swept through the territory. Her photograph, carefully tucked away in a small locket, bore a persistent reminder the way Lucy's eyes crinkled with laughter. How her presence had once filled every echoing space of this now painfully quiet home. Most mornings, Garrett would recite a silent prayer, gripping the locket as though Lucy could hear him wherever she was. The years since her death had become a steady trudge of unremarkable days, feeding the cattle, mending fences, ensuring the roof only leaked in 1 or 2 spots instead of 10. Money was tight, and the ranch had fallen on hard times without Lucy's knack for bookkeeping. She had always been the one to handle the numbers with calm efficiency, allowing Garrett to focus on the physical labor. But she was gone, and his ledgers now lay unopened on the kitchen table, collecting dust. The bank's letters, full of veiled threats and lists of overdue fees, weighed heavily on Garrett's conscience. Still, he carried on, shifting from chore to chore with a heavy sense of obligation. Over the last few months, the dryness of the season had left the well worryingly low, threatening the livelihood of both man and beast. Where Lucy's voice once gently guided him, he now faced the world alone, uncertain when, if ever, he would feel the spark of hope again. That morning, Garrett planned a necessary trip into town. He had a short supply list and little money to fill it, but it couldn't be helped. He hitched his 2 horses to the creaking wagon, double-checked the half-broken wheel he'd been meaning to fix, and stepped up onto the weathered seat. Before he left, he gave instructions to his only full-time ranch hand, Alan Parker, a young man who'd lost his own mother to fever. Perhaps it was that parallel loss that made them trust each other so easily. Alan was dependable, eager to prove his worth, and quick to offer a sympathetic ear whenever Garrett's grief seemed too present in his eyes. The ride into town took most of the morning. The path to Sagebrush Station was rutted and bumpy, and the August sun pressed down like a smoldering brand. Upon arriving, Garrett found little relief from the heat. The small station, a wooden structure with peeling paint, was oddly quiet. Folks typically scurried off as soon as they arrived, seeking shade and rest. Right away, Garrett noticed a figure in white perched on the far end of the bench, her travel trunk at her feet. She was still and composed except for the restless way her hands twisted a small telegram. Her face looked drawn, and though she wore a wedding gown, no doubt the best she had, he could see that her eyes were distant and full of hurt. As Garrett approached the station master to inquire about his freight, he overheard the man whispering to a passerby about a deserted bride. According to rumor, the woman's groom had backed out at the last moment, claiming she was too old at 42. Gossip in a small town travels faster than telegraphs. Garrett cast a sidelong glance at the mysterious woman, his heart twinging with empathy. He recognized loneliness when he saw it. She had the same hollow, resilient gaze he'd been wearing for 3 years, and in one swift moment, Garrett realized he felt something stirring deep within, a shard of recognition that her life too had become unexpectedly unmoored. He found himself walking toward her almost without conscious thought. A polite greeting felt insufficient in the face of such evident heartbreak. Still, Garrett tipped his hat, offered his name, and managed a kindly "Ma'am, you look like you could use a friend." She blinked up at him as if seeing him through a haze of shock and disappointment. Her name, she said softly, was Beatrice Monroe, and her voice trembled with the sting of recent betrayal. She had journeyed nearly 2,000 miles from the bustle of eastern cities all the way to this remote Wyoming outpost to marry a man named Harold Whitcomb, a man whose family decided 42 was far beyond marriageable age. Garrett felt anger on her behalf, though it surprised him. Usually after Lucy's death, he kept an emotional distance from everyone outside his small circle. But Beatrice stirred an old sense of chivalry, a desire to protect someone who needed it. He offered her water and invited her to rest in the wagon's patch of shade. Neither said much as the train pulled away from the station, leaving her behind like discarded luggage. The heat was unrelenting, but the deeper burn was in Beatrice's eyes. She recounted how she had answered Harold's advertisement in a matrimonial newspaper, how their letters back and forth had seemed so full of possibility. Then came the telegram in Chicago. Circumstances changed. Family objects to age. Strongly advise you cancel journey. But she had pressed on, convinced Harold wouldn't abandon her after the words of devotion he'd written. Now she felt fooled, and perhaps more ashamed than anything town chatter didn't help. Folks stared, commented, and pitied. Garrett knew precisely how pity could feel like salt ground into a wound. After all, had he not been pitied for losing Lucy? For drifting on a ranch that seemed bound to fail despite all his sweating labor? Something in Beatrice's demeanor, her posture, her quiet determination not to break down, echoed Lucy's own unyielding grace. He found himself offering her the only thing that seemed real and right in that moment. Mrs. Monroe, Garrett ventured, using the name she'd used for traveling. I haven't known you but a handful of minutes, and I reckon you know. Even less about me. But I see you're alone here. I see you've got nowhere to go, no place to lay your head tonight. He spoke slowly, each word feeling monumental. My ranch is lonely ground these days. I lost my Lucy 3 years back, and I can't say I've done right by the place without her. But I have a roof, I have land, and I have a heart that knows you're hurt. She stared at him, eyes wide. Even in her sorrow, a flicker of curiosity sparked. Then he asked the question that changed everything. What if you and I, two souls alone in this world, decide to join forces? What if we marry today? As soon as the words left his mouth, Garrett felt a wave of apprehension. It wasn't a typical proposal, and yet it wasn't purely a whim. Standing there in the oppressive afternoon sun, with townspeople gaping, he saw only one course that made sense. He offered respect partnership, and if she would allow it a second chance at a dream, she thought lost. Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes, though she did not let them fall. Are you certain? She whispered, her voice caught somewhere between hope and bewilderment. Garrett nodded. I might be crazy, but I am certain. She exhaled slowly. And then with a steadiness that astonished them both, she said, Yes, Mr. Lawson, I believe I will. They walked together toward the modest Highvale County clerk's office, stares and whispers trailing like shadows. Garrett kept a protective hand near Beatrice's elbow, introducing her to a few townsfolk as they passed. Their faces revealed a range of reactions: surprise, curiosity, perhaps a few frowns of disapproval. Yet by the time they reached the clerk's narrow, paper-scented room, Garrett could think of nothing but how oddly right it felt to be forging a new path with this stranger, Morris Cooper. The long-serving county clerk nearly dropped his pen when he recognized Beatrice in her wedding gown and Garrett Lawson at her side. Rumor had already reached him about the jilted bride. Mr. Lawson, he greeted, clearing his throat. Miss Monroe, this is quite sudden. Garrett nodded, a hint of a reassuring smile. It is. But sometimes life decides for us. Don't you think? Cooper glanced from one to the other, then sighed and pulled out the necessary forms. Under typical circumstances, there'd be a waiting period and more official rigmarole. But here in the frontier, and with the surprising backing of Station Master Gleason, who stood as a witness, Cooper agreed to expedite. Beatrice's hand trembled only a little as she signed her name in looping, precise script. Garrett's signature was blocky and plain, but he wrote each letter as if it sealed a vow. When done, Morris affixed his official seal, the heavy metal stamp hitting the parchment with finality. They needed one more witness. That role fell to Reverend Barlow, who arrived breathless and wide-eyed. Another wedding, Mr. Lawson, the Reverend said, voice dropping gently at the memory of presiding over Lucy's funeral. Years ago, I hardly know what to say. But faced with Garrett's unwavering sincerity and Beatrice's dignified calm, Barlow simply opened his worn Bible to a favorite passage about love, grace, and new beginnings. The ceremony was brief. A few onlookers from the street crowded inside, drawn by curiosity and good-natured nosiness. Garrett slipped a simple gold band on Beatrice's finger, borrowed from one of the onlookers who removed her own ring with a tearful smile. In exchange, Annette Holcomb, who owned the general store, insisted Garrett take her late husband's band to serve until they could buy one of their own. Beatrice's eyes shone with gratitude, and the hush in the room told Garrett that in this unorthodox moment, something profound was taking place. With the words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the hush broke into applause. The improvised wedding guests whooped, whistled, and offered blessings. Garrett found Beatrice's gaze, wondering if he should kiss her. She offered the slightest nod of consent, so he placed a gentle, almost tentative kiss on her lips. In that tender instant, a strange certainty welled in his chest. He felt Lucy's memory as a gentle presence, not a burden, and he sensed that the life he was stepping into might yet hold unexpected joys. They emerged from the clerk's office to a tumble of well-wishers. Gleason, the station master, insisted on handing them a bottle of cider for toasting new beginnings. Annette Holcomb promised them both that if they needed supplies on credit, they'd find no door more open than hers. Embarrassed by such a public spotlight, Beatrice simply nodded thanks. Her cheeks flushed. Finally, when the fuss settled, they climbed onto Garrett's wagon. The borrowed ring on her finger glinted in the afternoon sun, as if winking at the improbable stroke of fate that brought them here. And side by side, husband and wife, they steered toward the ranch that had once been Lucy's domain, ready to reshape it into their own. The ranch lay 10 miles outside Highville, accessible by a winding dirt track that had seen better days. Beatrice noted every detail as they approached the sagging fence posts, the withered grass, and the cluster of buildings, house barn, small shed, that formed Garrett's life. She saw in it both the quiet heartbreak of a place left behind and the untapped promise of land that could be coaxed back to health. They arrived close to sunset when the sky blazed with orange and crimson. Alan Parker rushed out from the barn, concern lining his young face. He glanced at Beatrice in her white gown, then back at Garrett. "Mr. Lawson is everything." Garrett dismounted and offered a hand to his new bride. "Alan," he said, voice remarkably calm. "Meet Mrs. Beatrice Lawson." The young man's eyes nearly popped out of his head, but once the shock subsided, he broke into a hearty grin. "Well, ain't that a surprise?" he exclaimed. Then turning to Beatrice, he tipped his hat. "Ma'am, if you need anything around here, just holler, happy to help." They walked into the main house. The interior was dark, musty, and cold. The windows shut against the high winds. The living spaces filled with battered furniture. A thick layer of dust coated a few unused surfaces. But the kitchen was functional enough evidence that Garrett hadn't starved in Lucy's absence, only by the grace of simple cooking. Beatrice felt the echoes of sorrow that still haunted the rooms. The faint floral curtains Lucy had sewn were pinned against the windows, a small testament to the woman who once breathed life into this house. Beatrice braced herself, fully aware she was stepping into a space shaped by another. "I figure you'd want your own room tonight," Garrett said, clearing his throat. There's a guest room that's a mite small, but it's got a bed." Beatrice nodded, sensing his uneasy mixture of politeness and fear of rejection. "Thank you," she said softly. Her new husband led her to a narrow bedroom on the right side of the hall. The bed looked sturdy enough, though it bore a threadbare quilt. The chest of drawers had one knob missing, and the oil lamp on the table needed refilling. Despite these flaws, Beatrice couldn't help but feel a swell of gratitude. She'd arrived at Sagebrush Station, expecting a humiliating return trip east. Now she had a husband, though a stranger in many ways, and a refugee she could call her own. That first night, neither of them slept much. Garrett paced the house, checking doors and windows as though uncertain how to settle Beatrice. Behind her closed door, unpinned her hair, and shed her wedding dress, folding it carefully. She gazed at her reflection in a small spotted mirror, wondering if this was truly her life now. At 42, she thought her chances at family and love had withered, but there on her hand sat a ring that represented a promise. She breathed slowly, pressing a palm against her fluttering heart. By dawn, the hush of the ranch gave way to morning chores. The rooster crowed with infuriating punctuality, and Beatrice rose determined to do her part. She found Garrett in the kitchen, struggling to light the stove for coffee. "I can handle that," she offered. He stepped aside, offering a tired grin. Within minutes, she had water boiling and bread toasting in a skillet. Even a simple breakfast felt momentous, like an unspoken agreement that they were in this together. While the coffee percolated, Beatrice asked about the ranch accounts. A shadow passed over Garrett's eyes. He muttered something about banks and poor harvests. She nodded and said, "Let me see the ledgers." It was the first small step of many she intended to take, bridging their two worlds and forging a true partnership. Days stretched into weeks, and the transformation around the Lawson Ranch was nothing short of remarkable. Beatrice began by tackling the neglected ledgers, and what she discovered was sobering bills, unpaid bank warnings near the point of foreclosure, and lines of figures that made little sense. Undaunted, she dedicated each morning to reorganizing the finances, scribbling in neat columns across fresh pages, searching for every penny that might keep them afloat. Garrett, astonished by the efficiency he had witnessed Lucy display, long ago watched in gratitude. Where he felt overwhelmed, Beatrice found clarity. In the afternoons, she ventured outside to learn the rhythms of ranch work. She'd never saddled a horse before meeting Garrett, but soon she was helping Alan feed cattle, check fence lines, and gather eggs from the half-wild hens that roamed near the coop. The sight of her in Lucy's old work apron, a bit big in the shoulders, struck Garrett in a bittersweet way. But every time he thought to mention Lucy's memory, Beatrice encouraged him gently. "We don't have to hide from the past." She'd say, "I'm grateful to step into what she built here." In the midst of chores, an idea took shape in Beatrice's mind, a makeshift school for the local children. Highvale had a sparse population scattered across wide ranches. Many families struggled to teach their young ones the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was an invitation from Annette Holcomb, the store owner, that kindled this idea. Annette mentioned her daughter's craving for an education, lamenting the distance to the nearest formal school. The more Beatrice thought about it, the more a plan emerged. She could use one of the empty rooms Lucy had intended for future children, currently just a space for broken chairs and crates, and convert it into a classroom. The excitement in her eyes was like a lamp newly lit. She pitched the plan to Garrett after supper one evening, the two of them seated around the table with ledgers and coffee mugs. "We'd have to put in a stove for warmth, maybe build some benches," she explained, "but we could teach a handful of children. Their families might pay a small fee, enough to help with the ranch's expenses." Garrett listened, recalling Lucy once mentioned turning that same room into a reading library for the rancher's kids. The memory felt less like a stab of grief now, more like a gentle nudge. He took Beatrice's hand and murmured, "If you think it can help this place and the folks around, I'm all for it." So began the next chapter of the ranch's revival. Garrett and Alan hauled out cracked furniture, hammered together makeshift desks, and patched the roof until it was weather-tight. Beatrice wrote letters inviting local families to enroll their children in her sagebrush school. Within days, half a dozen replies arrived. Mothers and fathers were eager for their little ones to learn, even if it was only a few hours a day. The cost was modest, a small basket of produce, here, a few coins there, but it warmed Beatrice's heart more than any monetary sum could. She recognized in their responses a hope for a better future, something that she herself had nearly lost. By late autumn, a routine settled over the Lawson Ranch that felt like destiny quietly unfolding. Mornings began with Beatrice's gentle voice reading passages from Scripture, or a poem Lucy once loved, the smoky scent of coffee and sizzling eggs drifting from the kitchen. Garrett rose to fix fences or tend to new calves, carrying a sense of optimism that had been absent for years. Alan scurried between tasks, whistling cheerful tunes that echoed across the barnyard. And every weekday afternoon, a small group of children trudged or rode in from neighboring ranches. Their eyes bright with curiosity, Beatrice taught them to read, to write simple sentences, to master the tricky corners of arithmetic. When she rang the brass bell, a relic Alan had found in an old storage trunk, the children would settle into rickety chairs, giggling and whispering, waiting for her gentle instruction. Word of Beatrice's skill with numbers soon spread. It wasn't long before a few ranchers' wives began showing up after the children's lessons, hoping to learn bookkeeping themselves. They too had grown weary of watching their family finances flounder under uncertain times. In Beatrice's approach, they found clarity and empowerment. Garrett would return from the range to see the house lit into the evening, with neighbors seated around the big table, ink-stained fingers, practicing double entry accounts, while a pot of tea steamed on the stove. The ranch was no longer quiet or lonely. It pulsed with voices, ideas, and collaboration, a testament to what could happen when a single decision opened the door to possibility. As winter neared, storms rolled across the plains, bringing thick blankets of snow. The wind howled and the cattle needed extra care. One ferocious storm in early December knocked down part of the fence line and spooked the herd. Garrett, Allen, and even Beatrice ventured out in the biting cold to herd the cattle back. She surprised both men with her courage, riding alongside them, calling out instructions, her coat flapping in the gale. Upon returning half-frozen and exhausted, they found the house warm with a roaring fire. Beatrice had planned ahead, stocking logs inside. As she helped Garrett remove his coat, their eyes met a shared acknowledgement that they made a formidable team, tested now by both finances and weather. The year drew toward its end, and talk of the coming holidays sparked anticipation. Students drew festive pictures, decorating the makeshift classroom with paper chains. The wives who attended evening lessons planned a small Christmas gathering at the ranch, part potluck, part celebration of the season's blessings. Even as the wind rattled the windows and the ground lay frozen, the sense of hope and community inside those walls could not be dimmed. On Christmas Eve, the ranch bustled with neighbors, children, and the comforting aroma of spiced cider. Candles lit the tables, reflecting in the battered windows like distant stars. Garrett stood by the fire, watching Beatrice mingle, welcoming folks, exchanging stories, laughing with a lightness he'd come to cherish. He slipped a hand in his pocket where Lucy's old locket rested. He still carried it, not as a ball and chain, tethering him to grief, but as a small tribute to the love that had guided him here. In time, he intended to let go of that physical keepsake, but for now it felt right to honor both the past and the remarkable present. Later that night, when everyone had departed and Allen had gone to his cabin, Garrett and Beatrice sat together in the quiet. Soft embers glowed in the hearth. He took her hand in his and spoke words he'd been feeling for weeks. "You've given me something I never expected to have. Again, hope." She squeezed his fingers gently. "And you, Garrett Lawson, have given me the kind of life I thought was lost. I'm glad we took that chance." They were no longer two lonely souls stranded at a station by life's cruelties. They had found a place where broken hearts could mend, and where amidst the dust of disappointment, something beautiful could grow. And under the hush of a cold Wyoming night, they both understood that love at any age is as timeless as the prairie itself, resilient, sweeping, and quietly triumphant. In the end, Garrett and Beatrice's unlikely marriage proved that love and courage don't have expiration dates. Together, these two survivors defied small-town gossip, financial ruin, and fierce frontier storms to build something extraordinary. Their ranch didn't just thrive. It became a community beacon, turning hardship into hope and loss into legacy. Their incredible journey is a testament that resilience, faith, and determination aren't just words. They're the American way of life. Garrett and Beatrice remind us that sometimes the bravest move we can make is trusting our heart even when it seems reckless. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Do you believe fate guides us to exactly where we need to be? Could you have done what Garrett did? Share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button for more powerful real-life stories of grit, redemption, and the strength of the human spirit.